name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. All right, so maybe we'll have some stragglers coming in from the pancake breakfast. But let's see. Everyone enjoyed John's talk last week.
Yes.
Okay, Lacey and I were at a wedding, so couldn't be here. But I thought that it would be good if John gave a talk about sort of what was sort of happening in the Middle Ages. I guess, what were some of the things that John touched on last week? Yeah.
They were that the monks saved civilization.
Okay. Okay. Good. So, so one of the things we're going to see here is that after the fall of Rome in the West, this is really when monasticism in the West becomes a big thing, right? And I'm going to refer to, during the Second Romanization, I'm going to refer to as the Benedictines. I'm going to say, well, the Benedictines then converted a whole bunch of people. But I'm not going to have time really to go into like each and everything that they did. So that's quite why I kind of thought it would be good for John to give that particular talk. I know in the event that you guys are not that familiar with the Benedictines in the early Middle Ages, this is a really good book here. It's called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization by Dr. Thomas E. Woods Jr. This is the book that I think John was talking when he was here. Right.
Yeah.
So the reason why this is a good book is that it is a book. It is very well academically cited. It talks about a lot of things that are not normally found in sort of history books for high school students. And it's a book that is an easy read because it is targeted at people ages 16 to 24. So it's it's an academic book, but it's not like a heavy read. It's not meant for, it's not intended for scholars and things like that. It's intended to make things that scholars know easily accessible to the layperson that doesn't normally read a lot of history.
And the title one more time was?
It's called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, and it's by Dr. Thomas E. Woods Jr.
It's available in audio format.
Yeah, it's also available in audio format, and I was just told that they just released paperback editions starting this past September. You can find them on Amazon.
And it's Kindle too, I'm pretty sure.
And on Kindle, yes.
Oh, good.
Okay. So that's just a very good book if you're interested in what exactly the Benedictines were up to in the early and Middle Ages that allowed them to be so successful in converting barbarians.
You mean our children?
What? I suppose you can use those tactics as well.
Thank you.
But yeah, among the chapters in this book here, it talks about exactly how the monks engaged in, evangelization. It talks about what exactly the lives of monks were in the early Middle Ages. It talks about how the Benedictines sort of created the first universities. It talks about the achievements of Catholic scientists or priests and monks in the Middle Ages, the scientific achievements of priests and monks in the Middle Ages. The longest chapter in the book is actually regarding the church and science in the Middle Ages, trying to dispel the idea that the church was like holding back scientific progress and hiding the light of knowledge for several hundred years.
Thanks to that.
One of the chapters here is on art and architecture, and exactly where the art and architectural advances that happened during the Middle Ages. The origins of international law and legal codes as we understand them today, that's another chapter in the book. The church and the beginnings of modern economics in the Middle Ages, that's another chapter in the book. Another chapter on charity, how the concept of charity was sort of built in the Middle Ages, because prior to the Middle Ages there really wasn't a concept of charity that was in sort of the ancient Roman world. Then it talks about sort of the origins of what we call like the natural law tradition for morality and things like that. So those are the chapters of the book. It's a good book, and it's an easy read. So today we're going to be talking about what exactly happened between the fall of Rome and the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne. So the Western Roman Empire collapses in the early 400s. It begins collapsing in the early 400s after the Emperor Theodosius dies, and there have these series of succession disputes while barbarian tribes are coming in. As I mentioned before, Gaul falls in the year 406. The province of Spain falls in the year 409. Rome is sacked in the year 10. The Romans pull they cede England, right? They basically pull all of their remaining forces out of England to try to defend the continental Europe. They lose North Africa to the Vandals in the 430s, and then they lose Italy to the Ostrogoths and a combination of other smaller tribes in the 470s. All right, that's basically the Western Roman Empire right there. By the 470s, there's no longer an effective Western Roman Empire. And one of the things we saw was that because Constantine and Theodosius had were Christian emperors, one of the things that they had done is they had elevated important Christians to important political positions in the Roman Empire. So that when Rome is collapsing, what you end up with is stock in the Roman Empire is going down, but stock in the church is going up. So what ends up happening is that in lots of regions of the Roman Empire, Roman political authority is collapsing, but you still need someone to maintain the roads, someone to maintain the aqueducts, someone to supervise the bringing of cereal grains from the countryside into cities. You know, if you're in even a medium-sized city in the Roman Empire, you're going to have someone determine who the fire department is. You know, you're going to have somebody, you know, determine the local militia, you know, who's going to keep order in the streets, that kind of stuff. So what ends up happening is, when Roman imperial authority collapses, the only institution from the Roman Empire that has people who went to school and can read and write is the Catholic Church. So what ends up happening is you've got Catholic clergy, and you have Catholic clergy sort of de facto just sort of taking over these basic responsibilities the Roman government used to. So you end up with the Roman imperial government collapsing, church officials are starting to take over well, I've got this book on, you know, we've got this book over here about how to maintain the aqueducts. Who can read and write? Your local priest can. So your priest is going to take the book off the shelf and be like, okay guys, let's figure out how to maintain that aqueduct. Alright, since I can read and write, I guess I'm in charge. Alright, so we're now going to have a parish ministry on maintaining the aqueducts. There's now going to be a parish ministry called fire department. There's now going to be a parish ministry called road maintenance, and things like this. So all of these functions that used to be part of the Roman government get sort of subsumed by the bishop's office, local parishes, and even the Bishop of Rome. Right? So this is what basically ends up happening in the Western Roman Empire. Meanwhile, the church is sort of stepping into this gap, but now you have waves of barbarians coming in here, mass immigration of barbarians, who have been able to conquer the Roman Empire because of the weakness of Rome, sheer numbers involved in the immigration, and then, you know, violent weapons. So you end up with the church basically running day-to-day operations, and you have these barbarian tribes that prior to the invasion of Rome were nomadic. So you've got nomadic people with weapons, basically, ruling over the population and the church running day-to-day responsibilities. So what you're going to end up here with is, well, anyone want to guess what you're going to end up with after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West? Want to guess?
Panic.
Okay, you're going to have a little bit of panic. If you are the church, how are you going to try to resolve this issue?
Convert the
You're going to try to collaborate with the barbarians, right? You're going to say, well, they're much less likely to kill us off if we can convert them to Christianity. If we convert them to Christianity, in the process, we can teach them how the Romans did things. We know how the Romans did things. By the end of the Roman Empire, you know, the church was doing okay. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to Romanize these guys. So that's basically what ends up happening in the West. Before we get into there, I want to talk a little bit about what is happening in the East while all that stuff is happening in the West. I'll talk specifically about how stuff happens in the West after we talk about the East here. So, while Rome is collapsing and the Western Roman Empire is turning into a patchwork quilt of barbarian kingdoms, Rome is still around in the East. You've still got the Eastern Roman Emperor. He's still ruling from Constantinople. Right? You've still got all those Greek bishops over there in the East. They're, you know, still Bishop of Constantinople, still got a Bishop of Antioch, still got a Bishop of Alexandria. They were not hit by barbarian invasions. So they're doing pretty all right. But communications with the West are going to be problematic. First, I mean, communication was when the Roman Empire was united, communication was, fairly easy by the standards of the ancient world, right? You had a road system, you had sea routes that had been mapped out and were all sort of within one country, if you will. Right? The Roman Empire, you didn't need a visa or a passport to go within the Roman Empire. Right? The Romans controlled the shipping lanes, the Romans maintained the road systems, it was fairly easy to get around. But now what's happened is that in the east that's still the case, but now in the west you've got upwards of 50 or so different barbarian tribes, some of them bigger and more important, some of them smaller and minor, ruling over different parts of the west. So now if you want to travel over roads, you need to travel across the territory of maybe 5, 10, 15 different little barbarian kingdoms that are now claiming this territory that was once the Roman Empire, in order to travel between these barbarians, hope they don't kill you on the way over to getting a message to someone in the east. Shipping lanes. Shipping lanes, there's no one regulating shipping lanes in the west now. There aren't navies in the west. Difficult to get a message by sea over to Constantinople as well, or to Antioch, or to Alexandria, or to Jerusalem. So communications are going down, basically. You can still get a message across. There were communications, it's just the amount of communication between the western half of the Roman Empire and the eastern half of the Roman Empire are sort of declining. It's much more difficult to get those messages across. The messages are now much less timely. So one of the things that develops here is what we call Caesaropapism in the East. Caesar papism. Anyone want to guess what that's going to be? What? Under Caesar, okay. Caesaropapism. Yes?
Treating Caesar as a pope.
Treating Caesar as the pope. Now, this system begins to develop very soon after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. So basically, whenever there had been some kind of theological dispute in the East, who would the Eastern bishops try to bring in to solve the dispute? Who would they try to bring in to solve the dispute? Rome, the Bishop of Rome. Try to bring in the Bishop of Rome. A lot more difficult to get the Bishop of Rome to pick up the phone call now, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you need someone who's not a bishop in the East that might be able to arbitrate your dispute. So they start referring these theological decisions to the Roman Emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor sitting in Constantinople. So you end up with this system here where slowly but surely over the course, starting in the late 400s and going on all the way up until the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, you end up with the system where the Eastern Roman Emperor is gradually extending his control over the bishops of the church. The bishops in the East are more and more becoming functionaries underneath the control of the Eastern Roman Emperor. Now the earliest example of this, the earliest document we have demonstrating this is this letter on the top of your packet from Pope Gelasius to the Emperor Anastasius. And this is a letter that was written in the year 494. Pope Gelasius was the last African pope. He was pope from 492 to 496. So here's what Pope Gelasius writes to the Emperor Anastasius. There are two powers, August Emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, namely the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. Of these, that of the priest is the more weighty, since they have to render account for even the kings of men in the divine judgment. You are also aware, dear son, that you bow your head, that while you are permitted honorably to rule over mankind, yet in things divine, you bow your head humbly before the leaders of the clergy and await from their hands the means of salvation. In the reception and proper disposition of the heavenly mysteries, you recognize that you should be subordinate rather than superior to the religious order. That in these matters, you depend on their judgment rather than wish to force them to follow your will. So what do we get here already in 494? Rome collapsed in 476. What are we having already, about 20 years after the fall of Rome? What's he writing about?
He's telling him that you better back off and let the priests do their job.
Yeah, it seems already that the Eastern Roman Emperor, it seems to be trying to have people in the East depend on his judgment and force them to follow his will in religious matters. And this is also a very interesting letter here for Catholic social teaching and also politics in general, because Pope Gelasius here is indicating the first line here is very interesting, because he uses the word authority, in Latin auctoritas is the word that's used here, and royal power, the word he uses here is potestas. And there is a difference in Latin between the word auctoritas and the word potestas. The word auctoritas is literally translated as authority, but what authority meant in ancient Latin was the ability to make people want to do things. The ability to make people see things your way so that they will want to collaborate with you.
Persuasive.
Right? Power, potestas, meant the ability to coerce people to make them do what you want them to do. So he says, Emperor Anastasius, there are two powers by which the world is governed. The ability of priests, auctoritas, the ability to make people want to do things, to make people want to work with you, and the royal potestas, the ability to coerce people into doing things. It's like there's a time and place for both these things, but the auctoritas of the priests is more valuable, more important. Auctoritas being more important than potestas. So one of the things that's interesting about this is, on the one hand, it's kind of like a separation of church and state argument, in which he says that the reason why you need a separation of church and state is because the authority of the stuff that church is concerned with is so much higher above politics that you need a separation of church and state, not for the purpose of protecting the state, for the purpose of protecting the church. So this is one of the first times we have a separation of church and state argument being made. It's made by Pope Gelasius, and it's made for the purpose of protecting the church from the coercive power. So how does the separation of church and state evolve as a principle? And it starts with Pope Gelasius here, arguing that you need a separation of church and state, not to protect the state from the church, but to protect the church from the state. That's one thing. Let's see. Another thing that's very interesting about the Gelasius letter and this sort of paradigm that he brings up is, let's see. I lost my train of thought. Okay, if I think of it, I'll come back. There was a second thing. Anyway, well, moving on. So, Pope Gelasius writes this letter, and it seems very clear already why the Eastern Roman Emperor is trying to make this stuff happen. Pope Gelasius writes saying, we cannot have this kind of system. Okay. Another thing that's happening in the East is that you think about, well, I guess when we talk more about sort of the intellectual history of Christianity, we'll talk more about what the heresies were and what they meant. But suffice it to say, at this point, most of the heresies from the three, like the Arian heresy, that started in Egypt, the Monophysite heresy started in Egypt, the, Monophysite heresy, the Manichaean heresy, all started in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Pelagian heresy, well, that started in the West. The Monothelite heresy, if that's going to start in the Greek East. So one of the recurring trends we get here is that in the East, this is where a lot of your heresies are beginning. And part of the reason of this is that by this time in the West, the West is in survival mode. They don't have time to debate the theological niceties of the hypostatic union. There aren't too many people sitting around being like, let's try to figure out exactly how Jesus can be both man and divine at the same time. Everyone's just kind of like, look, fine, Jesus is human and divine, let's figure out how to deal with the barbarians. In the East, you've got people have more leisure time in the 400s and 500s. They have groups of theologians that will sit down and they will debate this kind of stuff. To put this in perspective, right, the Eastern Roman Empire at this time, we know they had theological street gangs. They had street gangs devoted to theology that would go around and, overturn different people's stuff in the marketplace if they didn't agree with if they took a certain point of view on the virgin birth or something like that. There was, we know, especially from the Council of Ephesus already, the Council of Ephesus in the early 400s, there was this dispute over Nestorianism, which, you know, was Mary really the mother of God, or was she only the mother of the human being, Jesus of Nazareth? And there were these like street gangs that would go around Constantinople, and they would go to the store vendors, and they would say, you know, are you with us, or are you with them? And you know, if you answered the wrong way, or you know, if you answered, they would quiz you, do you believe this, or do you believe this? And if you believed the wrong one, then they would, you know, upturn your stand. And then if you, if you said that you believed that you agreed with them, then they would offer you protection from, you know, the other street gangs. So like the street gangs were about theology in the Eastern Roman Empire. But part of it is you have these heresies beginning. In the Roman imperial times, right? Two of the biggest libraries in the Roman Empire were in the East. Right? That library of Alexandria was in the Eastern Roman Empire, and then I think the other one was in Antioch. Antioch was also in the East. So most of the intellectuals in the Roman Empire had camped out in the East. Big libraries were in the East. Plus, you've got leisure time for people to sit around and debate about the nature of the hypostatic union. You're much more likely to get theological discussion resulting in heretical points of view. Also, by the 600s, you've got the rise of Islam. In the East, you are losing territory to the Muslim caliphs starting in the 630s. So starting in the 630s, you know, they've lost Syria, they've lost Jerusalem. Right, by the 660s, they've lost Egypt. By the 680s, they've lost North Africa. All right, so they're losing lots of territory to the Muslims starting in the 630s. So the East eventually is sort of, you've got Caesaropapism developing because you can't get ready access to the Bishop of Rome anymore. You've got heresies developing for the reasons I said before, and then you have these territorial losses to the Muslim caliphs that are also happening to the point where the East, by the 600s, the East is very concerned with fighting off the Muslims. They are less concerned about restoring communications or helping out the Western Roman Empire deal with the barbarians. All right, any questions on what's happening in the East right now? Okay. All right, let's go to the West. So pretty much everything else in this packet is basically it's a copy from Butler's Lives of the Saints about all these different major figures in the church. Now, I'll point out that none of these guys, we're doing a political history of the church right now, none of these guys are politicians, but because they were big missionaries, because they were big saints, oftentimes what they would be doing would have political implications. So let me give some examples here. Okay, Ireland. Ireland goes Christian in the 400s. Because of who? St. Patrick. All right. So one of the big things here is that Ireland, let's see, what was St. Patrick's death year? I think it's 460.
461.
461. Okay, so St. Patrick dies in 461, already having gotten Irish evangelization well on the way. All right. So by 461, Irish evangelization is well on the way because of St. Patrick. Lots of Irish people are converting. Now, one of the big things here is that Ireland was not part of the Roman Empire. The Romans had never conquered Ireland. So St. Patrick, I think, is in Ireland starting in, say, the 440s. Rome in Italy doesn't fall until the 470s. So one of the things here is that St. Patrick is going to Ireland between the 440s and the 460s. He's converting lots of these different, like, little Druid tribes. And there are a couple of implications for this. Number one, first implication is that because he's converting a lot of these Druid tribes that had previously fought with each other, once he converts them to Christianity, the church becomes a focus of unity for these tribes. So the church actually creates enough unity amongst these Irish tribes that had previously been fighting to the point where by the 500s you've got a unified Kingdom of Ireland. That's unlikely you would have had a unified country of Ireland if you didn't have, or Unified Kingdom of Ireland, if you hadn't had Christianity there to unite these various Druid tribes. So what would happen is, you know, you convert this Druid tribe, you convert that Druid tribe, and then where did they get their Christianity from? Well, they got it from St. Patrick and like his students. So as they would evangelize other Druid tribes, they would be evangelizing them from like a common point of focus, a common origin. So as a result, as you convert more and more Ireland's Irish to Christianity, what you end up getting is, it's basically, they all have this common thing that's joining them together. They all got their Christianity from the same location, the same beginning point, so it's the sort of thing that they can, it becomes this unifying force in Ireland for that reason. Another interesting thing here is that Pope Leo the Great, Pope Leo I, fully endorses St. Patrick's mission to Ireland. And he gives lots of resources from Rome for them to go to Ireland. Anyone remember from like 2 weeks ago, I was talking about Pope Leo. It was one of the big things Pope Leo had to do in the 450s. Let's see. Similar thing Pope Innocent had to do after the sack of Rome in 410.
He had to take over kind of doing the job.
Yeah. So in the 450s, Pope Leo is, again, you know, during this time in Rome, in the 440s, 450s, 460s, they're finding it, the Romans are finding it very difficult to get political officials to like say, why yes, I'm the leader of Rome, because you might be killed by barbarians now. So they're having this hard time finding, you know, like all the senators that are still around are like, you want to be emperor, don't you? Heck no. You know? You want to be emperor, right? I don't want to be emperor because Gaiseric the Vandal might come and kill me, right? So what ends up happening is Pope Leo I just sort of says, okay, those guys are over there fighting. All right, let's try to solve these problems. Let's use the church resources to try to figure out how to solve the problems we have in Rome right now. So you end up, as I mentioned before, with Pope Leo I negotiating with barbarians who want to sack Rome again. So Pope Leo, while he's doing that, is saying, yes, well, let's send some resources up there to Ireland to convert the Irish. This ends up being a very big payoff, because one of the things that he sends people from Italy. He sends books from Rome to help them out, and he sends money from the church in Rome to St. Patrick and his, you know, guys from Britain and Gaul who are going up to Ireland to convert the Irish. Now this is very significant because what are they evangelizing the Irish with? Oh, so if St. Patrick is getting a lot of his books and his personnel and his...
Well, they're getting everything from the Pope. It's kind of a direct link to the Pope.
Okay, so notice here, when they're evangelizing the Irish, what you get is lots of stuff that is going from Rome to Ireland at the same time when barbarians are like waving through Europe and destroying everything that was on the continent.
Right, so it saves it because it's on Ireland. It's the monks would reprint them and everything because they were not being impacted by the barbarians.
Because Ireland wasn't getting invaded by barbarians. Ireland wasn't part of the Roman Empire either. So what ends up happening is Pope Leo is sending the stuff with St. Patrick up to Ireland. They're converting the Irish. They're then creating these schools for Irish Druid kids up in Ireland. But all their educational stuff is coming from Rome. So they're being educated. So you're basically turning Ireland into Rome in Northwest.
Moving the capital Latin is the unifying thing.
Yeah. So what's going to happen is, as the barbarians are going through Gaul and Spain and Italy and wiping out stuff, like a lot of this, like Ireland's up there using books essentially, theology books that have been sent up there by the Bishop of Rome. So eventually, you're going to have Irish missionaries coming from Ireland back into England, back into France, back into Spain, back into Italy. So there was a book written in the 90s, I think, called How the Irish Saved Civilization. This is basically the argument of that book.
Yeah, they not only sent the text for the Catholic Church, they sent them a lot of things like from the Greeks too.
Yeah, yeah. So what Pope Leo does for St. Patrick, he's like, okay, well, I'm going to send you. Good job, you're having success. I'm going to send you a couple more guys. Who does he send up there? He sends people that have had a Roman philosophical and Greek philosophical education to help him out. Right, so this is often what happens. So Ireland becomes a key country that converts to Christianity. It converts to Christianity while Western Rome is falling. So while Western Rome is falling, you now have these different component parts of the Roman Empire. Gaul was part of the Roman Empire, Italy was part of the Roman Empire, North Africa, England, Spain, all parts of the Roman Empire. Now, eventually what happens is you've got all these different barbarian Germanic tribes that are coming in, and then what ends up happening over, from the 400s to the 500s, you end up getting certain barbarian tribes settling in certain regions, and then sometimes tribes being consolidated together. Now, the first of these barbarian tribes to convert within the Roman Empire, to convert fully to Christianity, or the first ones to reach out to Christianity is the Franks. The Franks who settled in Gaul. So to this day, the French always say, yes, well, we deserve special, like the French bishops, I guess going back, the French clergy always argue that they deserve special consideration because they were the first barbarian tribes to convert to Catholicism after the fall of the Roman Empire. And this is really funny during the French Revolution because, or prior to the French Revolution, because Louis XIV would always say, well, France doesn't have to listen to the Pope on that thing. Why? Because we're the oldest daughter of the church. We get certain special privileges. And the Pope would be like, well, that's interesting because Charlemagne signed this treaty saying you don't. So there was this, in the 14, 15, 16, 17, 1800s, there's this big back and forth between the French king and the French clergy citing stuff from like the 500s and 600s, and the Pope going back and citing stuff from the treaties from the 700s and 800s. Why I should listen to the Pope on this issue and things like that. So what ends up happening here is that in the early 500s, you have the king of the Franks, whose name is Clovis. Clovis converts to Catholicism. And Clovis converts to Catholicism for a couple of reasons. Number one, Clovis comes in and he says, okay, he wants to claim, so you've got the Franks, and the Franks are now ruling over, a large swath of territory that's part of the Roman Empire, and you have a lot of Christians living in this territory, lots of pre-fall of Rome Christians. And he thinks that things will go easier for him as the chieftain of the Franks if he can sort of claim some kind of continuity with Roman structures. What's the only Roman structure left? Church. So if I convert to Catholicism and I make it clear that I'm a Christian and I'm cooperating with these people, then it'll be easier for me to reconcile my tribe here with the people I've conquered. And one of the things he does is he decides that he is going to marry into, he's going to marry into a Roman family. So he asks for a Christian heiress from Rome to come up to Francia, Gaul, to marry him. And one of the things that and of course, this Christian family says, well, we're only going to do that if you convert to Catholicism. And he's like, well, fine, I assume that's part of the price. We'll do it. So what happens here is that over time, you've got the king of the Franks converts, and then it becomes cool for Franks to convert to Christianity, so that by the middle of the 500s, certainly by 600, most Franks have sort of become Catholic at this point. And one of the things that Clovis's wife, Clotilda, his wife was Clotilda, Clotilda does is she's from a wealthy Roman family, so she brings Roman heiress money with her to France, and she starts plunking down schools for Frankish kids, for the Frankish elite kids. She's like, okay, well, I'm coming here, I had this education down in Rome, I'm going to make this education accessible to Franks. So what does she do? She She sort of uses her money to build schools, and then she uses her family contacts from Rome to get people from Ireland down to staff these schools. So not only is it cool for Frankish people to convert because the king is now Christian as well. Now you've got the whole Frankish elite are now sending their kids to these schools that were established by the queen of the Franks now to get the Roman education so that they can say, well, look, we're sophisticated like the Romans were too. So a recurring theme we're going to see here is what we call the second Romanization. The first Romanization of Europe was basically on the swords of the Roman legions. The second Romanization is like a conversion of the people to Roman ways of doing things. So it's a combination of people coming back from Ireland, Benedictines. The Benedictine is the first major Western religious order established by Saint Benedict of Nursia in North Africa in the 520s. Catholic schools are going to play a big role here because a lot of barbarian people are now going to send their kids to these schools that are teaching things about Plato, Aristotle. They're going to learn to read and write. They're going to learn about law. They're going to learn how to maintain aqueducts and roads. And then dynastic marriages are also going to play a part. So in the case of the Franks, all of these things occur. There's a dynastic marriage. There's a desire to there's a political desire to maintain continuity, to show that you are being contiguous with the Roman Empire. Catholic schools are established to send your kids of your tribe to, and then who's staffing these schools? Well, Irish missionaries that are coming down from Ireland who are evangelized by St. Patrick, who got his stuff from Rome, and then you also have these Benedictines who are establishing monasteries. Oftentimes, these schools would be attached to Benedictine monasteries. So it's a sort of web of various things that are happening in each of these countries. Right, Italy in the 500s, they're conquered by Italy. The tribe that ends up going hegemonic here is the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths. And Theodoric, the Ostrogoth, was the king here. And so this is Theodoric. Yeah, Theodoric. Okay.
Red is out.
All right, so you've got Theodoric here, Theodoric. And Theodoric here, let's see, most of the Ostrogoths end up converting to Christianity for a combination of reasons. Number one, Pope John I. Pope John I convinces Theodoric that, he can play ball and he can work with the church, and the church will sort of show him how the Romans did things. We'll show you how to be more Roman, weren't the Romans awesome? In exchange, you will leave the church alone and you won't harass Christians and things like this. And Pope John here also, he establishes schools for the Ostrogoth elite kids, right? So, who does he staff the schools with? Well, he orders some priests from Ireland.
Again.
And then one of the biggest theologians from this period is Saint Severinus Boethius. I don't know if anyone's heard of Boethius. Boethius was from this time period. So you have this major theologian writing in Italy, starting in the 500s and 600s. So, and it becomes cool for Ostrogoths to become Christian here because I don't think Theodoric converted until very late in life, but Theodoric, lots of the elite members of the Ostrogoths start intermarrying with Roman families who are Christian, and we'll marry you on the condition that you become a Christian too. And please, send your kids to the Catholic school. They'll learn how to govern as the Romans did. Won't this be awesome? Right. After the elites do this, the people follow. Yes.
So if we're taking, if Italy and France and everything are taking all these people from Ireland, how is Ireland still doing at this time? Are they still being able to build up and convert new priests and all of this? Or?
Well, we will say here that the 400s and 500s were definitely the height of Ireland, or definitely the height of Irish political preeminence. Because what we are going to see here is that Irish monasticism is extremely popular in Ireland, and what happens is that you've got, where are the priests in Ireland who are, and what are the monks in Ireland doing? They're like, well, there's no more missionarying to be done in Ireland because all the people have converted. So if we want to do the Lord's work, where are we going to go? Well, we're going to go to England. We're going to go to France. We're going to go to Spain. We're going to go to Italy. How does Germany get converted? Well, St. Kilian, St. Boniface. Where were they from? Ireland. So I don't want to give the false impression to you that like all the priests and monks from Ireland are going elsewhere. What I'm talking about is, what we're talking about here is you've got, maybe groups of, 5 to 30 priests / monks at any given time going to these countries and starting schools. So I don't want to give the false impression that we're talking like hundreds and hundreds of people, right? We're talking maybe somewhere between 5 and 50 people, depending on the time period, that had a really big impact on the times. Yes?
Well, also what would happen was that the people that were in these countries would send people to Ireland to go to school to
Yes.
become priests.
Yes.
So some of them came back.
Yes, that's also true. Okay, so then, we've got Africa in the 530s. North Africa had been conquered by the Vandals. This was St. Augustine and Pope Gelasius' homeland here, right? St. Benedict of Nursia. It was during this period of time of the Vandals where St. Benedict of Nursia starts his religious order. The Benedictines then spread out of North Africa and into continental Europe. Right? Again, the Benedictines would often attach schools to their monasteries. England. Okay, I'll get to all. Let's skip England for a second. Let's go to Spain. Spain actually has a very interesting story. The Visigoths had taken Spain, had settled in Spain, and the kings of the Visigoths had actually been Arian heretics. Partially because at the time they were slowly coming into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had exiled all the Arians, so where did they go? They went to go live with the Visigoths. So what ended up happening here is that in the 580s, so this is Saint Hermenegild. Saint Hermenegild, on the back page. Right, so he dies in 585. He's martyred in 585. Basically, what happened here is that Leovigild is the Arian king of the Visigoths, and he wants his son, Hermenegild, his heir, to marry into a Roman family. He marries a Christian girl from a Roman family, and his father said, "You have to, in order to marry, I want you to marry her, but I don't want you to give up Arian heresy." And Hermenegild says, "Fine, I won't," and then he ends up getting converted by his wife. He has been executed for converting to Catholicism. His younger brother, Recared, however, is very impressed that his older brother was willing to do this. He learns all he can about Catholicism, and when his father dies, Recared becomes king. Recared then becomes known as a very, very good and popular king amongst the Visigoths. By the end of Recared's reign in the early 600s, most Visigoths have converted to Catholicism because of Recared's popularity. So that's the Visigoths. A key figure I want to point out here is Pope Gregory the Great, one of 2 popes, normally referred to as the Great. Leo the Great, of course, and then Pope Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great he's Pope from 590 to 604. He is from a Roman senatorial family. He inherited estates in Gaul, in Rome, in northern and southern Italy, and also in Sicily. He then gives up his inheritance to become a monk, turning many of the family palazzos into monasteries. Pope Gregory the Great then is basically dragooned into being a priest. He wanted to be a monk, and the Pope at the time, that came 2 popes before Gregory, said, "Nope, we need you as a priest." As a matter of fact, I need you to be the papal ambassador to the emperor in Constantinople. So he does that, and then once the Pope, after that Pope dies, he is unanimously elected as the next Pope, and he doesn't want it. He asks for a recount. He was unanimously elected again. So, Pope Gregory the Great is Pope from 596-04, and it is he that decides that it is going to be the official policy of the Church to absorb the barbarians. So this was sort of like so prior to Gregory the Great, everything that's happening here in the 4, 5, and the 4 and 500s is basically people flying by the seat of their pants, trying to make sure that the Church survives and the barbarians don't persecute the Church. Pope Gregory the Great now says the church is yes, the Church will definitively, we will work with the barbarians, we will try to absorb the barbarians, we're going to try to civilize and Christianize the barbarians. This becomes an official policy of the Church under Pope Gregory the Great. And he lets it be known to all the barbarian tribes, you know, he sort of advertises the Church as a way of connecting with the glories of ancient Rome. To the point where the King of Kent, so if you flip to the one on St. Augustine of Canterbury, who died in 605. King Ethelbert of Kent, so if you know the county of Kent in England, King of Kent, says he takes up Pope Gregory on his offer. He says, please send us smart Christians to help us do our stuff. And he sends him St. Augustine, Archbishop of Canterbury. St. Augustine then, with the full endorsement of the King of Kent, then imports people from Ireland, from Rome, to go and convert English people. So this is how England is sort of reconverted to Christianity. It's Pope Gregory is advertising openly that the Church can help you run your country. The Church can help you do this. The Church can help you do that. Why don't you want to become part of the Church? Right? The English say, that's what we want. So one of the things that Pope Gregory does is, Pope Gregory, there are basically three things. So Pope Gregory's big thing is, we're going to absorb the barbarians, we're going to assimilate the barbarians into Roman ways of doing things. We're going to partner with the barbarians. We're going to provide those barbarian kingdoms with education. We're going to also serve as the bureaucracy for these barbarian kings. As a way of sort of like, you know, mediating between these barbarian peoples who have come from afar and the Roman peoples that have been conquered. So Pope Gregory is basically like, okay, we don't want to have barbarian kings, people of Rome that have been conquered, and no buffer in between. So he sort of inserts the Church in between as sort of the middleman. Right? We can sort of advocate on behalf of the Christian peoples to the barbarians, and at the same time we can sort of, you know, blunt the sharp edges of the barbarians so that they're not, you know, like oppressing and going after the Christian peoples they conquered. The other thing here is that he basically, whereas before, prior to Pope Gregory the Great, in Rome and in most of central Italy, the popes had been sort of reacting to situations. If there's a problem, you take it to the Bishop of Rome. Bishop of Rome says, okay, all right, let's try to solve that problem. Pope Gregory the Great more or less says, the Pope is in charge of central Italy. We're going to eliminate this, chaos of not knowing who's really in charge. He's like, sort of plants his flag in the sand and says, Rome and central Italy, the Bishop of Rome is in charge with this until further notice. So when did the Papal States sort of begin? The Papal States begin under Pope Gregory the Great. He sort of says, who else is in central Italy to do all the stuff that needs to get done? Nobody. Bishop of Rome is. Bishop of Rome is now in charge of Rome and the surrounding area. And he does this because he basically says, look, it's going to be good, it'll be good, it's a win-win-win for everybody if the church is involved, right? It's good for the church because the Christian peoples won't be hurt, will be less likely to be hurt if the church is actively involved in the political scene. If the most educated people that are here, what happens if the most educated people who are here decide, no, we're not going to be engaged in the political stuff? You've got the blind leading the blind. You've got illiterate barbarians that have trial by ordeal as their justice system coming and ruling over Romans. Right? That's undesirable outcome. He sort of says, look, this will be a win for the barbarians. They'll learn how to read and write. They'll learn Roman principles of justice. They'll learn how to be civilized and things like this. They'll learn Christianity and they'll have an opportunity to be saved. And the peoples that they have conquered, you know, won't be oppressed by barbarian peoples. So this is sort of, Pope Gregory sort of sees this as a win for everybody. It's a win for everybody if the church is involved in this. If the church partners with the barbarian kingdoms and tries to build them up, this will sort of be a win for everybody. Germany starts being converted in the 700s. This is again by St. Boniface and St. Kilian. So another one of the saints in there is St. Boniface, the Archbishop of Mainz. There you go. He dies in 754. He is the apostle of Germany. He's the first person to successfully go into Germany and convert people. Because again, Germany had not been conquered by the Roman Empire. The Romans had tried a couple times and failed. So Boniface goes to Germany, and Boniface is successful in converting Germans. So again, he dies in the 750s. So, St. Boniface. One of St. Boniface's big ways of doing this was he would figure out he would spend time with the tribe. He would figure out what their local gods were. For the Germans, they were mostly nature gods. So all he would have to do is show that, you know, the one god that he's talking about is superior to nature, and then he would win a whole bunch of converts. There's one story where he went to a tribe, and the tribe would like worship a particular tree, and they believed that, you know, bad things would happen to people that did stuff to this particular tree. So Boniface like makes a bet with them, saying, "I bet you if I chop down that tree, nothing will happen to me." And they'll be like, "Oh, well, you know, the tree god is going to smite you." And he's like, "No, I'll make you a bet." And they're like, "Fine, you know, if that happens, nothing happens to you, then you will have proved your god is superior." So Boniface chops down the tree, nothing happens, and the whole village converts to Christianity. This was sort of a story, a common story that people would tell about St. Boniface. You know, it was this kind of stuff. You know, he is eventually martyred. He chops down one tree too many. But anyway, so that's the deal. Does anybody have any questions?
I have just one question,
Sure,
not so much about this. Clovis's wife,
Clotilda.
Clotilda, did she become a saint?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, I thought she might.
Yep, St. Clotilda. Yep. Yeah, so one of the things we see here is that certainly by the 700s, what you see is, in the east, you've got the emperor sort of ruling over the church, and then fighting Muslims. In the west, what you have is the church partnering with these different barbarian tribes, building schools, encouraging the barbarian leaders to send their kids to Catholic schools, and then within a couple of generations, you would have, you know, you'd have the entire tribe converted to Catholicism. There were a couple of times where you had like really big conversions because you have a really big popular king who converts to Christianity, and that makes it really cool to convert to Christianity. For example, in Visigothic Spain, you know, Recared the Great converted to Christianity, and whoa, we're going to go do that too. So for the most part, it's, you know, in the West, by the 700s, you have the church partnering with barbarian tribes, building them up from nomads to sort of organized kingdoms with borders on a map, with, you know, some kind of legal code and some kind of, you know, bureaucracy and some kind of, you know, something. Ability to collect taxes. As a matter of fact, for the Visigoths, as a matter of fact, the first law, you know who wrote the first law code for the Visigoths, ever? Saint Isidore, Bishop of Seville, in the 580s and 590s. So, Saint Isidore, the Bishop of Seville, wrote the first legal code and created the first judicial system for the Visigoths. You know, so it's one of these things where the church basically wrote the first legal codes for lots of these tribes that come in. And that's something that is discussed in How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, where it talks about the nature of Western law. You know, that's a similar thing that happens all the way over here. You know, but it just happens in Spain, a particularly important, you know, law code writer. It's a saint, the bishop of Seville. Sure, what's up?
Eastern.
Yep.
There are so many heresies, they couldn't get a unified military to fight the Muslims.
Oh no. Well, the issue is that they had a unified military. It was just that a couple of things. Number one, prior to the 630s, the Byzantines and the Eastern Roman Empire have been fighting with the Persians over control of the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. So by the time the Muslims come on the scene, like the Eastern Roman Empire had been kind of exhausted financially, personnel-wise, and revenue-wise to fight the Muslims. So in the 630s, right, they surrendered the city of Jerusalem. They can't defend it, right? They end up getting their butts kicked in Egypt in the 660s. They're unable to defend large swaths of the Eastern Roman Empire. And then whenever they're not fighting the Muslims, they then have political intrigue in the East, where you've got different factions in the East sort of fighting with each other in order to unify the country. So it's a combination of we were fighting the Persians, we're now too weak to resist the Muslims, and then whenever we're not fighting the Muslims, we then fall back into our political divisions and fight amongst ourselves. Yes?
Well, you can also count in that they converted the Persians. The Muslims did, because most of the Persians converted to Islam.
Yeah.
And they couldn't beat the Persians. Now they've got twice as many people that they're fighting against. It kind of set that part of the world back to the 600s for 1,000 years. In many ways, because they were sitting there, the philosophy, the Christians were a minority against Islam.
Yeah, I will say that like Persians, so Muhammad spends most of his life unifying the Arabian Peninsula. They then break out of the Arabian Peninsula, and who were the two empires that border the Arabian Peninsula? The Persians, now Iran, and the Eastern Roman Empire. So they sort of break out, they conquer these territories from the Eastern Roman Empire. Eastern Roman Empire can't respond. They then conquer Persia, and then that's a heck of a lot of territory right there. I don't necessarily want to say that when we talk about sort of the Muslim opposition to certain scientific advances, that is not so much a product of the 600s. That's much more a product of the 10 and 1100s. Because what happens is when the Muslims conquer Alexandria and Antioch and Jerusalem, they then have access to these big caches of Greek philosophy that the Romans had been storing in these libraries. So you had like big Muslim philosophers from the 800s and 900s, like Orense, who read Aristotle and had written lots of tracts about explaining what Aristotle had to say and how the Muslims could apply Aristotle. That's why you had like Antioch had a system of street lighting, and Toledo over in Spain when the Muslims conquered Spain. Right, that was one of the most advanced cities in Europe at the time. Why? Because the writings from the ancient Greeks and the Romans had been disseminating throughout the Muslim world, but they hadn't through the Christian world because the Christians had lost access to those books. The Christians only gained access to those during the Crusades, when they take Jerusalem and they start sending these books back to Europe early.
Okay.
So it's only in the 10 and 1100s that there's like a Muslim counter-reaction against, the caliphs have a counter-reaction against Greek philosophy. So it's more of a 10 and 1100 thing as opposed to a 6 and 7 thing. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, is this is moving to present day?
Sure.
Is the church, and particularly in Western Europe, viewing the onslaught of Islam and Muslims? Is it something that is being discussed? I guess because it certainly is a threat
Well, I mean, the church in Europe has been discussing like the need for cultural renewal amongst Christians, because I guess if you look at the reason why there's so much Muslim immigration in Europe is because of depleted labor supply in Europe, and thus they need, you know, labor to be able to make things, and thus you're importing Muslims because they're, you know, you're importing Muslims in order to do, you know, labor market functions. So one of the things the church is talking about is the reason why you have that labor shortage in the first place is that you know, lots of only like 10 or 20% of Europeans identify themselves as Christians, lots of the church. So you have, you know, high rates of abortion, contraception, negative family growth, things like this. And then you have, in addition, the people in Europe that, you know, are having, you know, normal-sized families, you know, replacement level families, 2 or 3 kids at least. They're not really, you know, raising them as Christians, so they're sort of, you know, at the mercy of whatever the culture is, which is not necessarily one that would, you know, like ever since World War II, a lot of European countries, they don't really have, they're really trying to, you know, not focus so much on their heritage because they believe that it was their heritage that created, you know, in their view, the carnages of World War I and World War II, so we want to sort of get away from traditional heritage because traditional heritage created nationalism, and nationalism is bad. So Christianity is part of nationalism, so So the church is talking a lot about how can you take pride in your heritage and follow your heritage without being nationalistic and starting wars. You know, because that's a big concern. That's one of the big #1 things when you poll Europeans about why is people practicing Christianity? Well, we practice Christianity, we fought wars. Okay, well, I'm sure there are lots of other reasons why you fought wars than, you know, you were too proud of your heritage. So that's what a lot of the church discourse in Europe is right now. Is, you know, how to be proud of your heritage, how you can be a Christian in today's world, that kind of stuff. So, have a good week, everybody. Next week we'll be talking about what happens between Charlemagne and the Gregorian Reform.